What are some of the things we discussed in the previous class? So what did we look at in the previous class? Other than renaming your usernames to include your admission number, then your names, then your groups, which most of you have not done. Yes, Anthony. Anthony, Kevin.
Part of what we looked at was the different types of authentication mechanisms.
Okay.
So based on what you are, what you know,
okay,
what you have, and where you are.
And where you are. Okay. So we have three, sometimes the fourth one, about location. Can be split into the other three, but I also like to look at it from an independent point of view, as an independent parameter altogether. Okay, what else? What else did we look at? Yes, Brett.
We looked at we looked at passwords,
okay,
and how to, some of the password policies,
okay,
how to make a password stronger. Looked at some password hashing mechanisms.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. George Kimutai, I think your hand was up.
Brett has answered what I had in mind.
Okay. Gift, your hand was up also.
I think it has been talked about, but we also looked at the attacks that can be rendered on passwords, and we discussed about social engineering, the dictionary attacks, brute force attacks, and sniffing. Yeah.
Okay, so what different? Sorry.
The categories of the different passwords, where we have the one-time password, passphrases, and cognitive passwords.
Okay, categories of passwords. The different attacks. So dictionary attacks, trying to create a table of hashes from past known passwords or previously known words or commonly used words or existing words. Brute force attacks, which focuses on trying all possible combinations of characters for a particular password entry. So what are some of the measures we discussed that will be effective against brute force attacks or dictionary attacks or sniffing attacks, etc.? What are some of the controls that we could have? Logical or human related? Yes, Gift.
On the policies, we looked at making the passwords complex such that it will be costly to brute force or too expensive for the computer power. We also looked at password aging, so that you can have a password expiring maybe after 30 days and the user has to change. And then also having a maximum number of attempts for entering the password. So you can have that. If you enter maybe the wrong password thrice, then you're locked out of the system.
Okay, so password aging, policies on the strength of the password, so that we do not accept passwords that are weak in that system, just to avoid any potential vulnerabilities. We could look at a limit to the number of attempted logins within a particular duration of time. Idea being trying to avoid or get rid of attempted brute force attacks, and generally having stronger passwords, which we said is a shift towards passphrases and not passwords, just to have an emphasis on very long passwords that are also complex. Reason being that will make it a bit more difficult, a bit more costly to try and break into your system. Stronger passwords imply more time, more computational power. Yeah? You could do a comparison of the total number of combinations required against how fast a PC can handle floating point operations in terms of computational power, and you could more or less get an estimate of the total amount of time it will take to break into a password. So additionally, we could look at encryption of data, especially data in transit, data across networks, across client-server infrastructure or multi-tier infrastructure. And the idea is to avoid sniffing attacks, to avoid eavesdropping, through which we could get information that will be probably important in our reconnaissance process. Yeah? So I think we looked at that. Before we look at authorization, yes, also mechanisms to do frequent password auditing, just to ensure that our system is not vulnerable. So before we look at authorization or access control in terms of valid request to access a particular set of resources, there was a request in the previous class to look at some of the telecom concepts I mentioned in relation to CHAP, Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol, as an authentication mechanism that will come in as something that you know, something that you have. So we mentioned that we have a couple of algorithms that support security in mobile networks, especially GSM-based networks. So when I say GSM-based networks, I mean the variation from 2G to 2.5 all the way to 4G. They have similar architectures, changes over time, but generally fall under the GSM umbrella of networks. Although GSM on its own refers to the second generation, which is 2G, but we could use GSM to mean an umbrella of mobile networks that are based on a different access control mechanism, a different access network technology, mostly frequency and time division. Yeah? So just to look at that, to make sure that we have everyone on the same page. I'm sure the telecom students have looked at this severally. The ICS students, on the other hand, might not have gone through that. So we can explore that a bit so that we are all on the same page. Yeah? So the mobile networks, let's start with a bit of the architecture. So the architecture looks like this. Yeah, the architecture is based on three sub network components. Yeah, we have the mobile station, which is normally the handset that you have, the phone and the SIM card. Then we have the access network, or sometimes the base station subsystem. It's normally a wireless access subsystem. So you can see the components, the base transceiver station, which is the mast that the devices communicate to, and the base station controller, which is a slightly superior device that controls radio resources used for the wireless communication. So which area is assigned what band of the frequency spectrum. So that is what the base station controller will do. Sometimes the base station subsystem, the access network, is referred to as the radio access network because what is used is simply the radio spectrum. Then we have the core of it, which is mostly controlled by the MSC, the mobile switching center. And it's the device, it's a computational device that is responsible for switching calls across the network. So when you look at this architecture, we have the different levels. We have the access level, we have the distribution level, and we have the core network. So the radio access network is our distribution level that more or less supports aggregation of traffic from users towards the core and distribution of traffic from the core towards the users. So aggregation and distribution of resources or data. Now, generally, authentication will fall under instructions, under information about information. So in all systems that you look at, client-server systems, network systems, generally all systems will have two sort of dimensions that you can look at them from. Yeah? You could look at systems from the control plane and the data plane. So sometimes referred to as the signaling plane and the transport plane. So when you configure a server, you will have, maybe you have a web server and you want to be able to pull pages or web resources from the server to the client and get requests from the clients to the server. That is the data that you actually want to get, and you get them based on request, on that request response situation or scenario. However, you have other bits of data that are normally exchanged before the actual data is exchanged, before the intended data is exchanged. For example, at what point is a client authenticated? At what point is the protocol agreed upon between the server and the client? Yeah. At what point do we tell the server to probably handle requests in this particular manner? At what point do we tell the server to queue requests and have this request based on a first come, first serve scenario or the queue? At what point do we prioritize some requests such that a particular request is given priority over another? So we have the plane, the dimension that looks at control information, or what in databases you will refer to as metadata, data about data. How do we control exchange of data? What are the instructions on how we are going to exchange the information we want to exchange? So that dimension where we look about instructions about how we are going to exchange data is what we call the control plane or the signaling plane. And the actual data being exchanged after authentication, after the control data has been passed around, then that is a transport plane or the data plane, which is sending information that was actually meant to be sent. Okay? So same scenario applies to the mobile networks, and authentication will fall under part of the control plane. So the idea is to try and verify that this client is who they say they are, and additionally, also look at what they are allowed to access in the system and what they are not allowed to access in that system. So the mobile switching center has additional components which might be distributed, might be separate physically from the actual device. Just a minute. Any individuals with challenges accessing the class? Still having individuals having challenges? There is a complaint here that some of your classmates can't access the class. Okay, the change of password. You could just check your emails. I shared the details of the class, so you should have them. Yeah? I changed the password, I think at the beginning of every first class of the week, sometimes every class. So you can always check. Okay. So we could have components directly attached to the MSC as logically distinct components, but physically the same components. So we have what we call the authentication center, which stores the same information as what we have in the SIM. So primarily we have an identity key, which is stored in the SIM, and we have an identity key similar to what we have in the SIM in the authentication center. Yeah? And that is what they actually have. They have the information. So after that, the MSC will generate a random number that is sent across the access network into the mobile station, and at the same time ask the authentication center to do calculations, to do XOR operations on that combination, the identity key that originally is there and the random number that was generated. So the idea is to come up with a response which is a combination of the key and the random number. So the signed response from the mobile station and the signed response from the authentication center represents the two data sets that will be compared. Yeah. So if the two data sets match, then the mobile station is actually authenticated and able to access the network. After that, then a couple of things can be done, a couple of functions if it's a request to do call establishment or location updates and so on. We will not go into the details because it's not a telecoms class. Yeah, we are more or less trying to look at the security aspects of the network, of the mobile network. Yeah. So based on whether the comparisons match, then that's the point where access is granted or access is denied. Across mobile networks, you as a mobile station, you will always get feedback from the core of the network, depending on what the result of the process is. Yeah. So yeah, based on that, we could establish the call. We could try and have a mobile station make calls and connected to the call party and try to monitor for how long the channel was active, and based on that, billing can be done based on a tariff whether it's postpaid or prepaid, and many other processes. Yeah? So more or less, the challenge is the random number. The response is a signed response from both perspectives, from both subsystems in that network. Okay. Okay. So basically, that is how the A3 algorithm works. Yeah. A5 and A8 will be a bit different, and their focus is also different. The focus is not authentication, but key generation and encryption of data subsequently after key generation. Yeah. Okay. So I hope that helps demystify some of the things we mentioned in with regard to CHAP, especially in mobile networks. Yeah. So I hope that answers the question. Any concerns on A3 algorithm across mobile networks? Anything I might have left out? Okay, then we can move to authorization bit. Now, when we look at authorization, we are looking at individuals who already have access to the system. Yeah. Now, what we are checking is do they have access to a particular set of resources that they are requesting? Yeah. So authorization focuses on whether an authenticated user is allowed to access a resource that they want to access. Now, when we look at authorization is based on three, sometimes four different categories. We have discretionary access control, we have mandatory, and we have role-based. Sometimes we have an additional component, which seems to be a subset of role-based access control, but with a bit more defined roles or a bit more dynamic roles when we have attribute-based access control. Yeah? But that will be part of your first assignment. Yeah? Now, what is your understanding of discretionary access control? What comes to mind when you have discretionary access control? Discretionary access control, anyone? Yes, Moses.
I'm thinking maybe it's a type of authorization whereby, for example, for administrators of maybe sites,
Mm-hmm.
any application online.
Okay.
The back end, maybe it shouldn't be easily accessed by normal users, by third parties. There's a specific way you'll have to access it, after which it will have to authorize you. So I'm thinking that's an example of discretionary.
Sorry, I didn't get the last part.
I'm saying, let's look at an example of an e-commerce site.
Okay.
You have the the normal interface whereby basically users can see the products, prices, that stuff, yeah. Then you have the back end, whereby now you have to update the products, you have to update the prices, such, yeah.
Okay.
Now for discretionary access, I'm thinking that back end, the process of accessing it before you can access the interface, it shouldn't be quite clear to everybody. Like it's separate from the login and sign up for normal users. It's a different section whereby it can't be accessed generally by the normal users.
Okay, fair point. Fair point. Yes, Cyril.
Okay, discretionary. I think it's the term of discrete, where you find that the objects they're discrete to different users. So you find, like, let's say if in the class we have different objects that they belong to different users, you find that each user will actually put a way in which their objects can be accessed. So it's discrete to different users.
Okay. Yes, Brett, your hand was up.
So I'm thinking, if I can give an example of server administration from our previous unit, we learned that users have different groups to which they belong. Let's say you have some particular users who belong to a group of admins, and those admins can access a particular file. So that is, I think, is discrete to those admins only.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Partly what you've all mentioned, but the idea is in discretionary access control, access to a resource is determined by the owner of the resource. Yeah. Like Brett was trying to explain, when you look at your server admin, there are a couple of things you used to do. For example, when you create a resource, not everyone has access to the resource. However, the owner of the resource, the user, can decide to change permissions to that particular object, to that particular resource. So because they get to determine who has access to the resource and who can also give access to the resource, then that is why it's discretionary access control. The access to resources is determined by the owners of the resource. The owners can be changed and the permissions can be granted to other people who again can decide who else can have access to resources. Yeah. So discretionary access control is based on giving or restricting access based on who owns the resource. Yeah. So the different subjects that that have ownership can give control over access or over assigning access to other individuals. Yeah. Now, this is very common in almost all systems. Most systems, from web systems to operating systems, for some of the resources, you will actually have discretionary access control. Yeah. So if you're the owner, or you have permissions to administer the system, create resources, change these permissions, then you get to determine or change who has access and who doesn't have access. Yeah? So you could add new access rights and assign them to different users. You could revoke them as well. So the owners determine that. Now, based on what you covered in your server admin, not sure if that was last semester or the previous semester, or the semester before that, you came across some commands that are a bit common in Unix and Linux-based operating systems. Yeah? So we have a couple of commands that could be run across these Unix or Linux operating systems. So any hints or any ideas on what these commands do? So what are what are the functions of these commands? Yes, Isaac.
Okay, so there is, I'll talk about the first one, which is you're basically changing the mode. So what that means is, so you see this file.html has this combination 755. So that means the first digit is for user, group, and others. So by 7, it means that it's defining access. So does that person has read, write, or executes? Yes. So it's basically giving access to the different types of users, so that the owner, the user, and like other people access to that particular file.
Okay. So if a user created the file and ran the command, the idea is they are defining who has permissions and what kind of permissions to that particular resource. So the user, the owner, probably has all the rights: read, write, and execute. The others, the others in his group, and the other general users will probably only have read and execute privileges. The second one. Yes, Anthony, Kivai.
The second one, you're giving both the user, the owner of the file, and the group that the owner is in. You're adding execute permissions. You're adding execute permissions to them for the 5 year.
Okay. Austin? Austin Waigwe?
Yes, I had the same answer for the command, for the second command.
Yeah, the third one. Yes, Stacy.
For the third one, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
For the third one, it's removing the execute permission from others in the file .css.
Okay. And the last one? The last one? Yes, Anthony. Anthony, Kivai.
I think it's changing the default access for the file such that the user will automatically have access to everything, and the people in the group and other people may only have read and execute permissions.
Read and execute. Okay. Yes. So the idea is, as the owner of the resource, you get to assign different privileges. Yeah. So the first one is normally a bit common for web servers. The owner can do everything. The rest of the individuals have limited access, mostly execute and read, no rights, which means they cannot change most likely the configs. Yeah? Then you can add specific privileges to a user or to a group of users. So this is a bit more relative. So adds permission to the permissions that existed. You could also remove or revoke permissions from what existed, like we have in the third command. And finally, the umask, which is does the same thing as the changing mode, but the values are inverse of the values of the umask are normally the inverse of the values of the change mode. So for those of you who've interacted with networks slightly more, then umask and changing mode are similar to having subnet masks and wildcard masks when either defining a network or defining maybe access control for the network. So you have a subnet mask and a wildcard mask, which is an inverse of the subnet mask. Okay? Makes sense from a binary point of view. Now, this is in most Unix operating systems. The same thing applies to other operating systems. In Windows operating systems, you can change the properties of files, determine whether it's hidden or not, whether you have you want to have people sharing the file or not, whether you want to have people having access to the file or the folder or not. Yeah? So discretionary access control is more or less hinged on the owners of the resources. Yeah? So again, they revolve around granting access or revoking access to particular files and directories. Yeah? Okay. Then we have the second mode, which is mandatory access control. And it's a bit different from discretionary access control because the enforcement of who has access and who doesn't have access is mostly done at kernel level. Yeah, it's common in some of the operating systems. It might be optional in others, but it's an important access or an important authorization technique because it is less less likely to be exploited by authorized users. Yeah? So in mandatory access control, resources are normally labeled. They are tagged depending on how important the information is at different levels. Yeah? And and the subjects, who are the users, are also have labels. They have sort of security clearance labels. Yeah? And whether or not you've been granted access to a resource, if your label is not supposed to access a resource with another label, then you will still not be able to have to access the resource. Yeah. So in mandatory access control, we have enforcement of authorization from the operating system level, from the kernel level. Yeah. And everything is hinged on the tags and labels for the resources and the objects and the subjects respectively. Yeah. Now, if you've tried to do changes to say the Windows folder, then you might be the admin, but there are things you cannot do in maybe the System32 folder. Yeah, there are applications you cannot delete and applications that you cannot add to that particular directory. Yes, in some cases you can change the names, which sometimes gives you enough control over what you want the system to do. And in some cases they give you ways to probably bypass authentication mechanisms and so on. But generally you may not delete some folders, some directories. You might not add applications to those directories, so on, simply because even as an administrative user, it's beyond what you're allowed to do in that particular system. Yeah? So in that kind of scenario, then we have mandatory access control. Yeah? In Linux systems, we have a bit more decentralization. And in some cases, you can delete everything. Yeah. For example, you can decide to delete the mounting point, the root, and get rid of everything, which means you will not have the operating system eventually. At some point, you will get to a deadlock because the process that is doing the deletion cannot delete itself if it's still running. So you will have challenges here and there. But yeah, generally allows you to do that, which means we do not have mandatory access control unless we enable some of the optional features that come with Linux operating system. So I am not sure whether you've come across Linux and AppArmor, which are mandatory access control features that come with Linux operating systems, and they provide that sort of Flask architecture. They protect some of the resources from unauthorized access, even by administrative entities. Yeah? So you get to define the labels for both resources and subjects, and based on that, we can tell who can access a resource or not. Yeah? So anyone who's come across security enhanced Linux or AppArmor, Debian-based distributions? Maybe you can look into them. They will also be part of your first assignment anyway. So if you decide not to, you will still have to look at them as you do your first assignment, which I should share before the end of the week. Okay, that's good. Maybe you can share your experience from security enhanced Linux or AppArmor. If it's on CentOS, then it's definitely security enhanced Linux. Yes, Wanye or Kivai.
So for me, I was learning on how. Okay, I was trying to create a web server in a CentOS operating system. So I was trying to use the HTTPD server. Then, like, I realized every time, I put the content in the server, each and every time, like, I'm trying to refresh the page, but nothing is happening. So when I looked up on it, I realized that those the security Linux policies that if you put something in a folder that is, in that case, that was labeled as a web server, the folder was labeled as like a web server resource, something like that, tagged like that. But the content that I put in it wasn't labeled as that, so it couldn't serve it.
So by default, you didn't have access because your label wasn't allowed to access that particular resource.
Yeah.
Okay. So the same applies to Debian-based distributions. They have AppArmor, only that I think the labels are not defined on the individual objects, but as paths to the objects. There's a small variation, but basically they do the same thing. They try to provide mandatory access control. Then we have, before we look at role-based access control, of course, you will notice a couple of terms, objects and subjects and access rights for access control. So objects will refer to the resources, subjects will refer to users, and access rights more or less refer to the relationship between the two, which user has what kind of access rights to which object. Yeah? Users can have different permissions. They can have read access, they can have write, they can have execute. So go through the data, can view the data, can append to the data that exists, or overwrite the data. You could also have execute. You could also have variations of write, maybe create a resource, delete a resource, and so on. And we have, generally the different writes for the different subjects, the different writes on different objects. So generally you end up with some sort of access control matrix, which is a list of what users have access to and what kind of access rights they have on those objects, and the objects themselves, what kind of permissions are on them. So you end up having an access control matrix, which is based on that. Yeah? So in role-based access control, there is a bit more of dynamism. So we do not just have users with different groups. We also have roles. So the roles more or less are linked to access rights, to permissions. Yeah? Now, role-based access control might be a hybrid of the other two in some ways. And it's particularly important or vital in organizations that have very many users, or in systems that experience lots of users with dynamic permissions, or frequent changes in the kind of permissions they have. So there is frequent updates of permissions, or revoking of permissions or the access rights. Yeah? So in role-based access control, the permissions are linked to roles. So roles have to be predefined, and the roles have to have the different access rights. Then individual users can be added to roles over time. So role-based access control will try and provide an easier way of managing multiple users across an enterprise with multiple resources, whose access rights keep changing depending on the context, or maybe keep changing across time. Yeah? So we end up having, sorry, I just lost power briefly. So that might be the reason why you could not hear me. Yeah? So I was saying that a role-based access control is particularly important in network-based authentication. Yeah? So in the case where you have Active Directories to provide your AAA services across the enterprise. Yeah? So I think we can stop there. I can see that most of you are proactive enough to start adding their names for the attendance. So you can do that, and then we can pick up from there in the next class. Sorry about the blackout. So I can take any questions you might have. You could also share any concerns via email in case you need to leave. Once you've added your names, you're free to leave the class.